Good morning for those on the American East Coast. Good afternoon for those watching from Israel and wherever you're watching from. This is the FDD Morning Brief. I'm Jonathan Conricus, Senior Fellow at FDD, filling in for Jonathan Schanzer. This is Monday, September 15th. The war in the Middle East that Israel is facing is now 710 days old. And welcome back to our morning brief. Today's guest is quite special, and it's a unique and rare opportunity for FDD supporters and others to get a first personal and unedited impression from Shane O'Connor. He's a humanitarian advisor with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, based in the Tel Aviv offices. We will be discussing the role of the ICRC, humanitarian organizations and aid efforts in Gaza, how Israel is coordinating, and perhaps what these organizations, ICRC and others, have learned so far from almost 2 years of war and multiple hostage release situations. Stay tuned. That conversation will start in just a few moments, and I assure you that it will be pretty special and it should be interesting. Now, in terms of where we stand and the current situation, action-packed 2 weeks ahead for Israel. There's a lot happening on the ground. With regards to combat operations, things are happening around Israel, and a lot is happening in New York. On the ground, what Israel is doing is that it's applying pressure on Hamas in order to agree to Israel's terms to end the war, to hand over all the hostages, to surrender, and to negotiate how the day after in Gaza will look like. Those are Israel's demands, and that is why Israel is applying a lot of military pressure. Israel has started with the tactic of bringing down high-rise buildings that Hamas uses for military operations. We'll speak about that. But the gist of it is Israel applying pressure, hoping for Hamas to take the deal and spare Gaza and spare Israel the need to go in and do it. It remains to be seen if Hamas will succumb to the pressure, as we're looking at the results of the Israeli strike in Qatar, still assessing whether or not all of the Hamas senior terrorists were taken out. Reports don't look too promising these days, but we will get into that as well. And Israel is facing perhaps the most challenging situation it has faced since the first Intifada, and you watching perhaps remember further back than that, in terms of its international standing and the massive onslaught, diplomatic onslaught against Israel. Teeing up is 2 weeks of UN General Assembly, where there will be Western countries stumbling over each other to recognize the so-called Palestinian state, and a general onslaught on Israel, coupled with, of course, Qatari ambitions to use the opportunity presented with the strike on Qatar and to see how they can leverage that diplomatically and regionally. So it's going to be very interesting weeks. We will start with the headlines and then go on to the interview. So the IDF started prepping for an offensive against Hamas in Gaza City. It is home to Gaza City, roughly 1 million people, give or take, but numbers are quite sketchy. According to IDF estimates, some 300,000 have already evacuated, and that is in spite of Hamas intimidations and orders to the population not to do so. Tens of thousands have done so over the weekend, and it is, of course, based on the orders that the IDF has given for the Palestinians to get out, because the IDF is going to start main combat operations. Yesterday and today, early morning Israeli times, the IDF issued evacuation orders for at least 3 high-rise buildings in Gaza City. These were including one of the towers of the so-called Islamic University. The IDF subsequently, after making sure that there were no people inside, struck those buildings and they all came down. They were being used by Hamas as many other high-rise buildings that provide tactical vantage points for Hamas to monitor the movement of Israeli troops. And I would say that there's also a psychological effect involved here, that Israel is wishing to impress on Hamas that it's not only about the assets that they put on the tower, it's about the fact that Israel is now ramping up the pressure against Hamas and wants Hamas to get the message. The second headline is that we have an unfortunate, sad milestone that another Jewish Israeli citizen was caught spying for Iran, for the Islamic Republic of Iran. The offender, convicted man, is a 22-year-old named Elimelech Stern. Over the weekend, the Jerusalem District Court found Stern guilty of conducting contact with a foreign agent, which in popular terms would be spying, and conspiring to make threats. And if you've tuned into the FDD morning briefs before, you have heard Jonathan Schanzer speak about Iran's efforts to recruit Israeli spies. They have been broad and they have been pretty deep and diverse in Israeli society. Dozens of Israeli citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish, have been arrested since October 7, and now we're in the first stages of prosecuting and bringing them to justice. Stern is one of the first to be convicted. He confessed to being in contact with the handler, but he claimed that he wasn't aware that he had been recruited with two accomplices to help him complete assigned tasks. He was tasked by the Iranians with hanging flyers with bloodied handprints. You may have seen them, red handprints around Tel Aviv, and also asked to light a bushfire in Jerusalem and to leave a knife and sever a doll's head on the doorsteps of Israel's representative, the International Atomic Energy Agency, but he chose not to do those missions. And we know of other Israelis that have done similar tasks, whether it's spraying graffiti or providing information about the movement of senior Israeli VIPs, whether it's politicians or others. Now, for a third headline, which is quite interesting, regional here, is that the Arab and Muslim countries are going to meet today and tomorrow. And one of the topics that they're discussing after the Israeli strike on Hamas targets in Qatar is that they are considering to establish a joint regional military Arab-Muslim force. This isn't a new concept. Back in 2015, and this was covered by FDD as well, Egypt proposed the creation of a NATO-style Arab force after the Houthis took large swaths of Yemen. The idea was adopted in principle, but never came into fruition. 10 years and one Israeli strike in Qatar later, the proposal has resurfaced, and we will see if it comes into life. I think that would put Egypt in an odd kind of situation in terms of the peace treaty with Israel, but we will have to see and look at the details. Egypt wants the force to be headquartered in Cairo, no surprise, and for starters, commanded by an Egyptian. Subsequent commanders would be rotated amongst the 22 members of the Arab League, and perhaps other non-members would join. There'd also be a chief of staff, a planning council, and a civilian secretary general, so very NATO style. The joint force would have ground, air, and naval forces, as well as an elite troop or elite troops trained to do counterterrorism tactics and to undertake peacekeeping missions in the Arab world. Sounds interesting. Now, in terms of our interview, it's time for me to interview Shane O'Connor from the ICRC. Shane, please be welcome to the show. Shane, happy to have you here. You are the humanitarian coordinator of the ICRC, working out of Tel Aviv and dealing with what you would say Tel Aviv and the occupied territories, but basically dealing with Israel and its surroundings. Please tell us how long you've been here and what your job title encounters.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, Jonathan. Indeed, I'm humanitarian advisor sitting with the International Committee of the Red Cross in Tel Aviv. I arrived 16 months ago in May 2024, when we were already 6 months plus into this conflict. I work mainly in supporting the senior-most ICRC representative here covering Israel and the occupied territories. He sits in Tel Aviv. I support him in relation to diplomatic engagement with third states, and engagement with certain sections of the Israeli government as well.
Great, thank you, and welcome to the FDD Morning Brief. I'm pretty sure that most of the people who watch and read the tremendous output that FDD experts provide may not have had the opportunity to listen firsthand to an ICRC representative. So I'm happy that you're here, and hopefully we'll be able to inform people better about the situation. Now, There's talk with regards to the situation in Gaza. We know that it's far away and there's nothing tangible yet, but the Israeli demand, and that is supported by the US, is for Hamas to surrender and hand over all of the hostages, 48 Israeli hostages, those that are alive and those that have been murdered, on one day. Now, one question, knowing how important, how crucial ICRC has been in the previous delivery and release of Israeli hostages, a very simple and kind of technical question, but one that is important nevertheless. Would the ICRC be able to facilitate such a move? Would it be difficult? Or would the ICRC say, we can't do it, and therefore Hamas would have a reason to say it's not doable?
The ICRC stands ready to carry out this operation. Again, we do not have insight into the advancement of negotiations or discussions. What we try to do is to inform the parties of the ICRC's needs in terms of how to carry out a safe and dignified release and transfer of those deprived of their liberty. So in the case of Gaza, of the hostages. But the ICRC, whether it's 10, 20, or 48, the ICRC stands ready to perform its role of neutral intermediary if it's permitted to do so and afforded the conditions to carry out that role as we would wish.
Thank you, Sean. And I picked up on the fact that you said dignified, and that brings me to actually a dignified release of people that were deprived of their liberty. That brings me to what many in Israel in the pro-Israeli world have been quite frustrated with, and that is those coordinated and big TV PR ceremonies that Hamas did many times or always broadcast live on Al Jazeera, where unfortunately and probably without wanting to do so, ICRC members or personnel on the ground were used by Hamas as props. And I remember reading Eli Sharabi, the very famous and extremely brave Israeli hostage. I just finished reading his book. And in the sentence where he speaks about the good encounter, the page where he speaks about the great encounter that he had with an ICRC person just after he was transferred, his second question was, or actually another hostage that sat there next to him was, where were you all the time? And that brings me to, and where were you all the time, and why didn't the ICRC visit us or provide us with anything? And that brings me to a very important topic, and that is, what has the ICRC learned over the last 2 years, and what kind of lessons do you think that the organization may try to implement looking forward to hopefully ending the war, hopefully returning and freeing all of the hostages, and getting Gaza on some kind of a track for a reconstruction? But if you could share a few of the lessons that have been identified by the ICRC regarding its role, and perhaps also the image of the ICRC.
It's a very good question. I think there are two specific elements of interest within that question, Jonathan. The first relates to what the ICRC has done since day one, since October the 7th, 2023, to try to access the hostages. From day one, we've been very clear that hostage taking is strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law. So the body of law that governs the way in which the ICRC works, and essentially the law of armed conflict. So from day one, we've called for the immediate release of all hostages. Pending that release, we've asked for the ICRC to be able to visit those hostages, to bring medicines to those hostages, to obtain family news, to provide family news, to share family news, and to obtain proof of life so that we know the fate of those hostages that are being held. To date, we haven't managed to achieve this, but the effort has not stopped. That effort has been unrelenting since day one. It continues today, which brings me to the second part of your question, which is what happens when there is a ceasefire agreement between the parties mediated by third states. Now, we've seen this happen twice since the beginning of the conflict, and the ICRC has participated in the release of 140 or so hostages overall, including 8 human remains of hostages as well. During the last ceasefire between January and March of this year, the ICRC facilitated the release and transfer of hostages on 9 occasions, 38 hostages, 8 human remains as well. It was challenging work, and from the outset, what we asked for in very simple terms was for the conditions to be in place to allow for the safe, dignified release of those hostages. Now, week to week, what did we encounter on ground? Dignity was out the window. I'll say it very bluntly. One week to the next, there was nothing dignified about the public curiosity, about the crowds, about the frightening situation in which hostages were being released, and in which our staff were trying to operate in the most respectful, effective way possible. The calculus on ground, when we saw that the conditions requested were not in place, the calculus was simple. After, and at this point, you're talking about hostages that have been held for over 500 days. Bear in mind that we deal with hostage families all the time. We talk to hostage families, we talk to the family forum. We've seen the utter despair of people that have their loved ones in Gaza that don't know if they're alive or dead, and that just want to know. They live with this, they get up with it in the morning every single day. They live with that anguish of not knowing. So the calculus for our team on ground is dignity is not here. Can we get these people out of here safely and back to their families? And one weekend to the next, that's what we did. We made that decision. We're going to get the job done. We know we're going to be criticized for this, but the outcome will be these people return to their loved ones at the end of the day. And for us, that was the best we could do in an extremely challenging situation, which brings me to lessons learned. And you'll forgive me if I'm being a little bit long in my response, but the lessons learned and the considerations we would have firmly in mind should we get to a ceasefire agreement in the coming days or weeks, and we all hope we do, are to ensure that the parties themselves and the mediators, including the US, that are dealing with the parties, have firmly in mind what the needs are in relation to carrying these operations out in a safe, dignified way. We all went through it, and the whole world saw the conditions under which those first operations happened. The situations of civilians today, hostages in Gaza as well, demands that things are done to a better standard. The ICRC does not have the hard power or the capacity to force things to be done to a certain standard, but those negotiating and those supporting negotiations, we would hope that they're able to bring their influence to bear to improve the conditions for release.
Okay, thank you for that long answer. And I'm sure that I won't surprise you by saying that there are many hoping that, of course, all of our live and dead hostages will be returned as quickly as possible, and that they won't be used, and that neither ICRC staff will be used as props for Hamas propaganda. And I hope that the organization will be able to prevent that from happening through various leverage or different types of leverage that the organization may still have. That brings me to another question, which I think is a great opportunity for you, perhaps, the ICRC, perhaps, I was a spokesperson for the IDF, and I can understand what it is to represent an organization which I feel is misrepresented and sometimes, many times, not given, fair treatment in international media. I think that the situation regarding the ICRC is a bit similar, so I'll combine two questions into one. What things do you think the world, and specifically Israelis and pro-Israelis, don't really understand about the ICRC? And a follow-up and connected to that question is that, if you take stock of the level of trust that pro-Israelis have, and probably many others that are unaffiliated with international NGOs operating in Gaza, I think many would say, and we've seen this in American surveys and European surveys, they would say that there's great corruption and that many of the international NGOs that are affiliated with the UN are actually front organizations, and in some cases actually working with Hamas and helping Hamas, and they're part of a disinformation campaign against Israel. How do you think that the ICRC can distinguish itself from that? And coming back to the first question, what do you think that people don't understand about the ICRC that is important for them to know in terms of its mission and operations?
I'll start with your first question. So I think one of the things that is misapprehended, misunderstood the most is the concept of neutrality. People believe neutrality indicates a lack of empathy. And I want to go on record and be very clear, that's absolutely not the case. Neutrality is not an end in and of itself. It's a means to an end. It's a choice that every ICRC staff member makes every day, despite their deep feelings in the context in which they're working or any personal opinions they may hold. They choose to be neutral, to have the trust of the parties, to get to places where others cannot go, and to perform tasks that have humanitarian benefits and that are not easy to carry out. So our choice to be neutral, to attempt to be balanced, to be circumspect in what we say publicly, do not think that that does not mean that we're incredibly forthright and direct when we speak to the parties to the conflict about their responsibilities under the law of war. We are. We say things that people do not want to hear, but that they absolutely need to hear. So I think that's one of the most important things. Neutrality should not be confused with a lack of empathy. In terms of what distinguishes the ICRC from other organizations, the ICRC is distinct from other organizations in terms of the unique mandate we have. We're the guardian of international humanitarian law. We've, again, had this important role to play in conflict zones, ensuring that parties to conflict meet their responsibilities and obligations under the law of war. We do this through bilateral, confidential dialogue. We're not a public-facing advocacy organization. Our favorite approach is always to understand firsthand what's happening on ground. That's why you will find us in high-risk areas, in conflict zones, sometimes at great personal risk. And we have lost colleagues and had colleagues wounded in the course of the last 22 months in the conflict in Gaza. We go to these places to obtain our information firsthand, and when issues arise, we present it to the parties to the conflict. We don't speak about it publicly necessarily. We'll speak about the consequences of conflict, but when it comes to issues on ground in terms of the way the war is waged by the parties, we'll speak to them directly, because over 160 years, experience has taught that quiet diplomacy and saying these things directly can actually result in a better outcome than some of the other approaches that other organizations take.
Right. Well, I think those are important distinctions. Some may argue about how well that has worked. I mean, I respect the ICRC definitely, but in terms of getting to hostages, that I think it's a very raw topic in Israel. But nevertheless, Shane, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you for clarifying things and sharing the perspective of the organization. And I'm sure that we can all agree, you and I speaking and everybody watching, that hopefully you will have your hands full with, as you call them, people that have been deprived of their freedom, or Israeli hostages that will be returned to their loved ones. And hopefully we will have a better future for Israelis and other people for Palestinians in Gaza. And thank you to the staff that have been doing important and sometimes dangerous work on the ground. And that is, of course, appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so that's that part. Interesting perspective. Of course, the FDD, we continue to follow and analyze the activities of international organizations, those that are affiliated with the UN and those that are not, and to assess their role and how they're doing, and when necessary to comment and reflect on it and reach out and offer our suggestions on how things should be done differently. Here's a little bit of what FDD experts have on tap for you today. There's a lot to pick from. My colleague Mark Gerecht, writing together with Ray Takye, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, from the Council of Foreign Relations. They write in the Wall Street Journal, and they're highlighting how the 12-day war shattered a long-standing American assumption. The assumption being that foreign attacks on Iran would rally its people around the regime. In reality, the opposite occurred. Tehran responded not with unity, but with repression, and we've seen mass arrests and executions in Iran since the 12 days of war with Israel, revealing a leadership that is more shaken than resolute. Now the regime is turning to diplomacy in a bid to regain its footing, but make no mistake, it may be rattled, but it remains determined both to continue to provide weapons and funding for terror and to develop a nuclear bomb. Number two, meanwhile, FDD's Ahmad Sharawi makes a sharp case in The Hill, arguing that Israel's strike on Qatar should be a wake-up call to Arab states still sheltering Hamas, another terrorist. He urges a decisive course correction, expel the group. While such move may trigger domestic unrest, Ahmad rightly insists that Arab leaders must speak plainly. Hamas brings only suffering, and cutting ties is the first step towards a more stable and hopeful future for the entire region. I really hope that Arab leaders will read that. And I'll add that I just published in Hebrew Israeli media an op-ed that calls on Israeli leadership to prioritize international media. I published it in Hebrew. For those of you who read Hebrew, you can see it on N12, which is a very large and popular Israeli news site affiliated with Channel 12, and you can find it there. And finally, last but not least, don't miss FDD founder and President Cliff May's latest column in the Washington Times, where he dismantles the inverted truths about Israel propagated by much of the international community, which stem from falsehood and other issues rooted in Hamas's own narrative and propaganda. So lots happening, lots to follow, lots to read, and as always, FDD experts are busy thinking, writing, and communicating about what's going on. That's it for today's episode of the FDD Morning Brief. I highly recommend that for further reading and information, you go to our website at fdd.org, you read our quick takes on X, and watch the videos that we post on Instagram. Even though we're a think tank, we do interesting and unique stuff on Instagram and on YouTube. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief, guest host by my colleague Natalie Ekano. Until then, thanks for letting me host you today. I'm Jonathan Conricus, signing off for FDD. Shalom from Israel.